Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time we're exploring the ideas of Carl Jung and specifically his work, Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious.
It's a dense one,
Oh, it really is.
but super fascinating.
Yeah, so we've got some great analysis to help us break it all down. But just to kind of set the stage for people, what is it about this idea of the collective unconscious and these archetypes that Jung talks about that you find so interesting?
I think for me, it's this idea that's so big.
Hmm.
It kind of challenges how we see ourselves, right? Like we think of ourselves as these individuals, and then Jung comes along and says, well, yeah, but underneath all that,
Yeah.
there's this shared layer of experience.
Right, like we're all connected somehow.
Exactly. And it's not just some vague connection. It's like there are these patterns, these images, these kind of blueprints for human experience that we all tap into.
And those are the archetypes.
Yes, exactly.
So how does this how did Jung even arrive at this idea of the collective unconscious?
Yeah.
I mean, it seems like such a leap from, Freud's focus on individual experiences and the personal unconscious.
Well, it was a leap, but it was also a natural progression, I think.
Okay.
Jung started out as a follower of Freud, but eventually he kind of went his own way because he felt like Freud's theories didn't fully account for the kind of universal patterns he was seeing in his patients' dreams and in myths and religions from all over the world.
So Freud was all about the personal stuff and Jung was looking at like the bigger picture.
Right, and he realized there had to be something more than just our individual experiences shaping our psyches.
Okay, so he kind of went deeper.
He did. He went deeper. And he said there's this whole other layer beneath the personal unconscious that we all share this collective unconscious.
And that's where the archetypes live.
Exactly. The archetypes are like these primordial images and patterns of behavior that are kind of hardwired into us.
Okay, so let's talk about some of these archetypes, because this is where things start to get really interesting.
Yes.
Maybe we could start with one that Jung seemed to think was super important, the self.
Yes, the self is a big one. It's the archetype of wholeness, the totality of who we are.
So not just our ego or personality, but like everything.
Right. It's the conscious and the unconscious. It's all the parts of us,
Even the parts we don't like.
especially the parts we don't like.
Okay, so how does this self-archetype actually show up in our lives?
Well, Jung believed that we're all kind of striving towards wholeness, right? We want to become fully realized individuals. And that process, he called it individuation, involves integrating all aspects of ourselves, including those shadow parts.
Yes, the shadow. That's the one everyone wants to hear about.
It is a popular one. The shadow is basically the archetype of our dark side.
All the stuff we try to hide.
Right. All the fears, the negative thoughts, the impulses that we deem unacceptable.
So why is it so important to Jung's theory? Why not just try to ignore those shadow parts?
Because they don't go away just because we ignore them. In fact, Jung believed that repressing the shadow only makes it stronger.
Oh, so it can actually kind of backfire on
It can.
Yeah.
It's like if you try to push something underwater, it just pops up somewhere else. Jung argued that we need to acknowledge and integrate our shadow in order to become whole.
So it's not about becoming some perfect version of ourselves, but more about accepting the good and the bad.
Exactly. It's about embracing all of who we are.
Okay, so how do we even start to do that? How do we start to integrate our shadow?
It's a process. There are different techniques, but a good starting point is to pay attention to what triggers us. What are those things that make us angry or defensive?
Because those reactions are probably telling us something about our shadow.
Exactly. They're like little clues.
Okay, so it's about getting curious about those reactions instead of just trying to push them away.
Right. And then you can start to explore those shadow aspects, maybe through journaling therapy or other forms of self-reflection.
This is all very fascinating, and we've just begun to touch on the surface of Jung's ideas here.
Oh, yeah, there's so much more.
There's so much more. So I'm excited to keep diving into these archetypes and to see how we can actually use them to better understand ourselves and the world around us.
Me too.
All right, so we'll be back after a short break to keep going with this exploration. All right, so we're back, and we've been talking about all these fascinating archetypes like the self and the shadow. And I think a lot of people are probably wondering, like, how does this all fit together?
Well, that's where Jung's idea of individuation comes in.
Okay, yeah. So remind us again, what is individuation?
It's basically the process of becoming a whole integrated self.
So not about being perfect.
No, not at all. It's more about embracing all the different parts of ourselves, the good, the bad, the light, the shadow.
Okay, so it's about wholeness, not perfection.
Right, and it's a journey. It's not something that happens overnight.
So, like, where do we even begin on this journey?
Well, Jung believed that our dreams play a really important role.
Oh, yeah. Dreams,
He saw dreams as messages from the collective unconscious.
like little postcards from the archetype.
Exactly. And he encouraged people to really engage with their dreams, not just analyze them, but to kind of step into them and interact with the images and figures that appear.
Okay, so not just like, what does this dream mean, but more like, what is this dream trying to tell me?
Right. And how can I use that information to grow and evolve?
So he wasn't a big fan of dream dictionaries.
Not really. He felt like each dream is unique to the individual and that the best way to understand it is to kind of have a dialogue with it.
Okay, so how do we do that? How do we have a dialogue with our dreams?
Well, one technique Jung developed is called active imagination.
Active imagination.
Yeah, it's basically like using your imagination to kind of step back into the dream and interact with the characters or the symbols.
So like a guided meditation almost.
Kind of. It's about using your imagination to access those deeper layers of the psyche.
Okay, I like that. And speaking of deeper layers, we've talked a lot about shadow work and how important it is to confront those hidden aspects of ourselves.
It's essential for individuation.
But how do we actually do shadowing work? It sounds kind of scary.
It can be, but it doesn't have to be. You know, the first step is just to become aware of your shadow.
So like noticing those times when we get triggered or defensive.
Exactly. Or when we judge others harshly or feel envious or resentful.
Because those reactions are often projections of our own shadow.
Right. We're seeing in others what we don't want to see in ourselves.
So it's like a mirror.
Exactly. And then once we start to become aware of those projections, we can start to explore them maybe through journaling or therapy or other forms of self-reflection.
Okay, so it's about getting curious about those shadow parts instead of trying to banish them.
Exactly. And remember, shadow work isn't about becoming a bad person. It's about becoming a whole person.
Okay, so we've got these archetypes, we've got this idea of individuation, and we've got all these tools like dream work and active imagination and shadow work to help us on our journey.
Right, and don't forget about the stories.
Ah, yes, the stories.
Jung believed that myths and fairy tales and even movies and books all tap into these archetypal patterns.
So they're not just entertainment.
No, they're reflections of the collective unconscious. They're showing us these universal themes and patterns that have been playing out for centuries.
So like the hero's journey, for example.
Exactly. The hero leaves home, faces challenges, overcomes obstacles, and returns transformed. It's a story that's been told and retold in countless ways.
And it's a story that resonates with us because it reflects our own journey of individuation.
Right. We all face challenges, we all have to overcome obstacles, and hopefully we all emerge transformed in some way.
So those stories are like roadmaps for our own lives.
They can be if we know how to read them.
Okay, so how do we read them? How do we use those stories to help us on our own journey?
Well, one way is to pay attention to the characters and themes that resonate with us.
So like which characters do we identify with? Or which stories really grab our attention?
Right, and then ask yourself why. Why does that story resonate with me? What is it trying to tell me about myself?
Okay, so it's about looking for those personal connections.
Exactly, and then you can start to see how those archetypal patterns are playing out in your own life.
This is so fascinating. And I love the idea that we can actually use those stories, those myths and fairy tales to help us understand ourselves better.
That's the power of Jung's work. It's not just about understanding the psyche. It's about using that understanding to live a more meaningful life.
Absolutely. All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here, but I'm curious about what practical tools or techniques we can use to actually integrate these concepts into our daily lives.
That's a great question and one we'll explore in our next segment.
All right, so we're back, and we've been talking a lot about Jungian archetypes and individuation and all these pretty complex ideas.
Yeah, definitely a lot to unpack.
But, I think for a lot of people, the question is like, okay, this is all very interesting, but what do I actually do with it? How do I take these ideas and apply them to my own life?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is. So do you have any practical tips or techniques that people can use?
Well, Jung actually offered a few, and I think they all kind of revolve around this idea of active engagement with the unconscious.
Okay, so not just thinking about these things, but actually doing something with them.
Right, because ultimately it's not enough to just know about the archetypes or the collective unconscious. We have to actually experience them in order to really integrate them into our lives.
So what are some ways we can experience them?
Well, one technique we touched on earlier is active imagination.
Right, where we kind of go back into our dreams or use our imagination to interact with the archetypes.
Exactly. And it's really about using all of your senses, not just thinking about it, but actually feeling it, seeing it, hearing it.
So like making it as real as possible.
Right. And you can do this through visualization or writing or even art. whatever works for you.
Okay, so active imagination is one technique. What else?
Well, another really important practice is shadow work, which we've talked about a bit already.
Right, confronting those hidden aspects of ourselves.
Exactly. And I know it can sound kind of daunting, but it's really about bringing those shadow parts into the light so we can start to understand them and integrate them.
So how do we actually do that?
Well, a good starting point is to pay attention to those things that trigger us. Those times when we get really angry or defensive or judgmental.
Because those reactions are often pointing to something in our shadow.
Right. It's like those are the places where our shadow is kind of poking through.
Okay, so once we've identified those triggers, what do we do?
Well, we can start to explore them, maybe through journaling or therapy or even just talking to a trusted friend.
So it's about getting curious about those shadow parts and trying to understand them better.
Exactly. And remember, shadow work isn't about getting rid of those parts of ourselves. It's about accepting them and integrating them into a more whole and balanced sense of self.
Okay, so we've got active imagination, we've got shadow work. Are there any other tools or techniques that we can use?
Well, I think it's also really important to pay attention to the stories that we're drawn to.
You mean like myths and fairy tales and movies?
Exactly, because those stories often tap into these archetypal patterns, and they can give us a lot of insight into our own psyche.
So it's like those stories are speaking to us on a deeper level.
They are, and I think it's really helpful to pay attention to which stories resonate with us the most, and to ask ourselves why. Why does that story grab my attention? What is it trying to tell me?
Okay, so it's not just about passive entertainment, but about active engagement.
Right. And we can even use those stories as tools for self-exploration. We can journal from the perspective of a particular character or write our own myths or even use art to express those deeper psychological truths.
So we're not just consumers of stories, but creators as well.
Exactly. And I think that's really empowering, because it means that we have the power to shape our own narratives and to use those narratives to create a more meaningful and fulfilling life.
That's a great point. And I think that's a really good place to wrap up this deep dive.
Yeah, I agree.
We've covered a lot of ground here, but hopefully this has given everyone a good starting point for their own exploration of Jungian psychology.
I hope so.
And remember, individuation is a lifelong journey. So be patient with yourself, be curious, and keep exploring.
That's the key.
This has been The Deep Dive. Thanks for listening.